You just found out you're a father, or maybe you're about to, and somewhere in the back of your mind, quiet but persistent, a question flickers. You'd never say it out loud, but your brain asks it anyway. Is this baby really mine? That question feels modern, awkward, maybe even a little shameful to admit, but the real answer is far stranger than you think. That question is not new. It is not a product of soap operas or paternity test commercials. It is one of the oldest anxieties your species has ever carried, long before DNA, long before marriage certificates, long before language itself was fully formed. Your ancestors were already asking it. In their bones, in their behavior, in the way they built entire societies around a single unsolvable problem. Here is the problem. A mother always knows. She carries the child, she feels it move, she watches it emerge. There has never been a moment in human history where a woman looked at her newborn and genuinely wondered whose body it came out of, but a father has no such certainty, none, not one single biological signal tells him, with confidence, that the child in front of him shares his blood. This is called paternity uncertainty. And it is one of the most powerful forces that shaped human behavior, human emotion, and human society. Why would evolution allow such a glaring gap in knowledge for half the species? It didn't allow it, it responded to it. Think about what a father actually risks. Raising a child costs time, it costs food, it costs protection, teaching, years of investment that could have gone toward his own genetic line. If that child isn't his, every ounce of that investment silently benefits somebody else's genes instead. In evolutionary terms, that is close to the worst possible outcome. So your ancestors didn't just shrug and hope for the best, they built systems. Behavioral systems, social systems, even chemical ones, all aimed at closing the gap between doubt and certainty. The anthropologist Kermit Anderson spent years studying paternity confidence across dozens of human cultures. From small-scale hunter-gatherer societies to industrialized nations, his research found something remarkable. Men, across nearly every culture studied, consistently underestimate how often children are not biologically theirs. But more telling than the numbers themselves was the pattern underneath them. Wherever paternity was less certain, paternal investment dropped. Fathers gave less time, less resources, less warmth. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a switch, tuned by millions of years of selection pressure, quietly asking one question before it opened the tap of care: is this mine? So how did your ancestors try to answer that question? Long before any test existed, the first strategy was simple: control access. In many early human groups, and in countless societies that followed, male mate guarding became a constant, almost invisible behavior, staying close, watching, discouraging rivals, not out of pure possessiveness, but as a biological hedge against uncertainty. Psychologist David Buss, in his decades of research into jealousy, found that male sexual jealousy across cultures is disproportionately triggered by a partner's infidelity, while female jealousy tends to weight emotional betrayal more heavily. That asymmetry isn't random, it maps almost perfectly onto what each sex stood to lose. A woman never loses certainty about her child. A man risks losing everything he invested in a child that was never his to begin with. But mate guarding wasn't the only tool. Your ancestors also developed something far more subtle, a kind of built-in facial forensics. Here's where it gets strange. Newborns don't actually look like their fathers more than their mothers, biologically speaking. Studies on infant facial features find no reliable genetic reason a baby should favor one parent's face over the other. And yet, across cultures, something curious happens in the delivery room. And it happens almost every single time. Family members lean over the crib and declare, with total confidence, exactly who the baby resembles. The psychologist Stephen Plotek studied this phenomenon directly. He found that people, especially the mother's relatives, are far more likely to comment on paternal resemblance than maternal resemblance, even when no such resemblance can be objectively confirmed. Why would that be? Because it serves a purpose. If everyone around a new father insists the baby has his nose, his eyes, his exact scowl, it reassures him, nudges his paternity confidence upward, whether or not it's biologically accurate. Plotek's later work went further, using functional imaging to show that men's brains respond differently to photos of children depending on subtle resemblance cues, activating reward-related regions more strongly when a face looked more like their own. Our ancestors, without ever studying genetics, had already stumbled onto a psychological workaround: convince the father the child looks like him, and you increase the odds he'll stay, provide, and protect. There's a third strategy, and this one reshaped entire societies. If biology couldn't guarantee certainty, culture would try to manufacture it instead. Marriage, in an enormous number of human societies, functioned as a paternity confidence machine, restricting a woman's sexual access, publicly, formally, sometimes brutally, was never really about romance, it was infrastructure. It converted an unanswerable biological question into a social contract that at least gave men something to point to: strict inheritance laws, chastity expectations. Even something as seemingly small as a wedding ring, worn as a visible signal, all of it, historically, traces back to the same root problem: a father can never be sure, so build a system that makes sureness unnecessary. And there's a fourth strategy, one that's almost invisible because it happens without anyone ever discussing it out loud. Some anthropologists point to what's sometimes called partible paternity, found in parts of Amazonian South America. In several of these cultures, it was believed a child could have more than one biological father if the mother had multiple sexual partners during pregnancy. Anthropologist Stephen Beckerman documented this belief among groups like the Bari of Venezuela, and found something unexpected: children recognized as having a secondary father showed higher survival rates. Multiple men, each holding a partial belief in paternity, each contributed food, protection, and care. Instead of solving uncertainty by narrowing it down to one man, these societies solved it by spreading the responsibility across several, a completely different answer to the exact same ancient question. So think about what's actually happening the next time you see a father staring at his newborn, searching that tiny face for a familiar nose or a familiar chin. He's not being paranoid, not being old-fashioned. He is running a program that has been running, uninterrupted, for hundreds of thousands of years, a program built by every ancestor who ever guessed wrong, invested in the wrong child, and lost precious resources because the doubt was never resolved. A program refined by every ancestor who guessed right, who found some clue, some social structure, some small psychological trick that tipped the odds back in his favor. Modern DNA testing changed the stakes, but not the instinct. Today a man can know, with total certainty, in a matter of days, and yet the emotional weight of the question hasn't shrunk at all. Anything, home paternity testing kits have exploded in popularity over the past 2 decades, because the underlying anxiety was never really about proof, it was about an ancient itch finally getting scratched. You don't consciously walk around calculating paternity probability, nobody does, but the systems your ancestors built are still humming quietly underneath your everyday life. Jokes about the mailman in the family gatherings where someone always insists the baby has his father's eyebrows, in the wedding rings people still wear without ever asking why the tradition exists, in the quiet relief a new father feels when someone, anyone, says the words, "He looks just like you." That relief is ancient, it is not new, it is not shameful. A signal, inherited from thousands of generations of men who faced the exact same unanswerable question, and built an entire architecture of behavior, culture, and belief just to make that uncertainty a little more bearable. Next time you catch yourself, or someone else, searching a newborn's face for a resemblance that may or may not really be there, remember what you're actually witnessing: not paranoia, not vanity, a conversation between your ancestors and your instincts, one that started hundreds of thousands of years ago and never really stopped. You didn't invent the question, "Is this baby really mine?" Inherited it, and somewhere inside you, it's still being answered.